Okay, everybody, thank you for joining us here at the Humanist Association of Toronto, a speaker series at the Forum. Today we have with us Carter Hammett from Epilepsy Toronto, who's going to be speaking to us about invisible disabilities, especially regarding ADHD, learning disabilities, and also mental health issues. Carter Hammett is the Employment Services Manager with Epilepsy Toronto. He holds a Bachelor of Community Studies degree, along with diplomas in journalism, social work, and adult education. His work has appeared in the Toronto Star, National Post, and Toronto Sun, among other publications. He's the author of 3 books, including Benchmarking, a guide to hiring and managing persons with learning disabilities. So thank you very much for being here. With further ado, I'll hand you over to our speaker today, Carter Hammett.
Hi, okay, well, great to be back. Thanks. It's nice to be here once again, and I really appreciate the opportunity. So, and nice to see everybody here. So the last time I was here, I'm just going to be doing a screen share here. So the last time I was here, we were actually talking about, our focus was just on epilepsy. And this time out, we decided to broaden things somewhat to include a variety of different topics. Now, this is a huge, huge topic. So with the amount of time that we've got today, I'm only going to be touching on, I'll be touching on mostly on learning disabilities and attention deficit disorder. We'll be acknowledging mental health as well as we go along. So in terms of our outline today, we've got a question that maybe some of you haven't thought of before. What are learning disabilities? And we're going to go through some examples. We've got managing social information about invisible disabilities. We've got disclosure, workplace practices that support disclosure and accommodation, knowledge on benefits and costs of accommodations, and managing these topics effectively. So last time, as I said, we focused on epilepsy, which actually is an invisible disability, including while people are sometimes people are having seizures. It's almost impossible to tell that they are. And there's still a lot of research that continues to be done in this particular area, particularly and a lot of advocacy in terms of getting them recognized as a distinct segment of disability culture. So it's kind of a work in progress. There's really not a clear-cut clinical category or a distinct social identity that kind of wraps everything up in a tidy package. However, there are a number of physical and mental impairments and conditions that vary in origin, severity, permanence, or episodic nature. And this is something else that's very common. They are physically founded, they are socially constructed, and they are medically diagnosed. People with invisible disabilities are a diverse group with a wide range of needs and capacities. And as such, I like to actually frame it as a culture as opposed to a disability. And one common feature that they tend to all share is that the condition or the impairment is not always readily apparent to other people. So, first example, if you want to use that raise hand feature in your Facebook, I don't know if any of you have seen this before, but raise your hand if you can see the man in the coffee beans. I see a couple. Okay, good, good, good. Oh, it looks like a good majority of you might actually be stumped on this one. Okay, okay, good. So if Annie, can you tell me where you see the man in the coffee beans? Nope.
Well, Carter, I see him kind of at the bottom, just to the left.
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. And so this is this exercise serves a variety of purposes in terms of visual presentation, in how we interpret visual information that comes to us, how we process that, and how quickly it actually makes sense. And this kind of leads me into my eventual introduction to one of the disabilities we'll be covering today. So I wanted to first touch base a little bit on background of invisible disabilities. There are an estimated 40% of people living with disabilities that have invisible impairments. The Conference Board of Canada, which is one of my favorite go-to places for research and resources, stated in a report that not all disabilities are visible. In fact, most are not visible at all. And that's going to become apparent, I hope, in the next couple of slides. There's also an Invisible Disabilities Association of Canada, which is the local arm of several different agencies that operate throughout Britain and the United States. They've actually done reports, and this is a very rough estimate, but in terms of North America, it's estimated that as much as 10% of the entire overall population lives with some form of invisible disability. So what do these look like? This needs to be said that it's an ever-growing, expanding definition of learning disabilities. But so here is a basic representation of some of these. So it includes things like epilepsy is on the list, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome rather, anxiety disorders, depression, dyslexia, environmental sensitivities, mood disorders. The list goes on and on. One of the things I was a little bit surprised to see on there was repetitive strain injury. And a friend of mine who worked in a library at the Toronto Public Library for 35 years said, oh yeah, imagine putting books on a shelf for 35 years. Eventually something's going to go snap. And that kind of made a lot of sense to me. So there's a lot of librarians out there walking around in pain. Okay, so I got a couple of true or false questions for you. And we're going to be throwing these at you throughout the presentation. And I'd like you to use the raise hand feature if you'd like to participate. So the first question here is, at its core, dyslexia is a disability associated with vision problems. How many people believe that's true? Could you use the raise hand feature, please? One. Ooh. Maybe you're either holding back or you might have the right answer. Okay, so the answer is, in fact, false. While it's common for parents and teachers to believe that a child struggling with reading may have a functional vision problem, and they might, functional vision problems are only one of the symptoms that may accompany dyslexia. Glasses, eye exercises, and other vision therapies may help this one particular symptom, but other deficits also need to be addressed before dyslexia can be identified. So a lot of people with this condition, and by the way, the definition of dyslexia has recently been expanded in recent years to incorporate a whole pile of auditory processing. So things like separating words, sound blending, working memory issues, word retrieval access, which is sometimes referred to as dysnomia, and the inability to rapidly and automatically name or recall words all comprise this expanded definition of dyslexia. It's really, really interesting working with people who have this condition because they may have the same label, but it takes the different form for many different people. The other thing I think that at this point might be worth noting is that if you are over in England and Scotland, they have a tendency to refer to all learning disabilities as dyslexia, okay? Whereas And that encompasses, they use it as an umbrella term, as we'll see in a couple of minutes here. And the other thing about England and that part of the world is that they refer to what we refer to as intellectual or developmental disabilities in North America. They refer to as learning disabilities over there. So the terminologies and the definitions are not clear cut. They're not consistent. The Learning Disabilities Association people over here get very angry with me when I try to promote dyslexia as a terminology that could be applied to all learning disabilities. And sometimes they do it with good reason. Here is the Learning Disabilities Association of Ontario's definition. And I'm just going, this is, by the way, this took 2 years and $1 million to write. And I'm only going to read the top portion of it, okay? Because it goes on and on and on. But I think it's a pretty good definition for its time. So LD refers to a variety of disorders that can affect the acquisition, retention, understanding, organization, and or use of verbal and or non-verbal information. Right there, that's a mouthful. These disorders result from impairments in one or more psychological processes related to learning in combination with otherwise average abilities essential for thinking and reasoning. LDs are specific, they are not global impairments, and as such are distinct from intellectual disabilities. Learning disabilities can range in severity and invariably interfere with the acquisition and use of one or more of the following skills. And this includes oral language, reading, writing, math, the 3 R's as we used to call them. Learning disabilities can also cause problems with organization, social perception, and something called executive functions, which we'll talk about a little while later. So the term psychological processes gets broken down even further, and it describes an evolving, that's a key word there, evolving, because research is ongoing, list of cognitive functions. It's really important to recognize that this is one definition of learning disabilities. It is not the definition of learning disabilities. They've been arguing about this for decades now, about how to actually define it. And sometimes the medical definition is going to be different from the social work definition versus the advocacy position. So, however, people generally agree on the following as being processes related to the processing of information. So phonological, which is basically auditory, memory and attention, how fast you process the information, language processing, perceptual motor processing, visual spatial, and what we call executive functions. So in the broadest sense of the term, executive functions are a skill set that are located right here in your frontal lobes. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later on. All right. Can I get a volunteer, please? Michelle. Would anybody like to volunteer? Richard?
Oh, yeah, we did see you. I'm here.
Hey, how are you? Nice to see you. So can I get you to read something for me, please?
Sure.
Okay. Are you sure you want to do this?
No, I'm kidding. I'll do it.
Awesome. Okay. You're on. Go.
Oh my God, the whole thing. Okay. This is what dyslexia looks like. Dyslexia. Gian gets
don't worry about the website.
Oh, okay. A friend who has dyslexia.
Actually, I'm going to interrupt you right there. Okay. Can you try and find the right word that's supposed to fit?
Okay.
Okay. If you can.
I will. A friend who has dyslexia described to me how she experiences
reading.
She can read, but it takes a lot of concentration, and the letters seem to jump around. I remembered reading about, I can't pronounce that. Wouldn't it be possible to do it I can't get that one, on a website with JavaScript. Sure, it would. Feel like making, I can't read that, of this something, fork it on GitHub. I don't, yeah, oh wow, my brain just automatically.
Okay, you want to stop?
Yeah.
It gets difficult, doesn't it? It gets
Yeah.
difficult. Thank you. So can you imagine these words when I actually copied and pasted? Thank you very much, Michelle. I wanted to give you the impression of how information can be processed through the eyes of someone with dyslexia. Now, just to add further pain to this exercise, the words were actually moving on the page when I cut and pasted this. So it would have been even worse to reading. And it takes many, many different forms for many, many different people. So just because you and Michelle and myself may have the label of dyslexia, it's going to show up in different forms for different people. So thank you, Michelle. I really appreciate you, the effort here. Okay, so I've got a skill testing question for you. I want to throw out, so I can tell you that learning disabilities is an umbrella term. But I'd like to know how much you know about LDs, or how much you think you know. So the first skill testing question here that I have for you is, how many learning disabilities exist that we know of? Is it 14, 140, 1,400, or 14,000? And if you want to raise your hand, anybody who thinks there's 14, feel free to raise your hand. Let's see the feature here. No, okay. Anybody think there may be 140? Let's see, okay. How about 1,400? Okay, now I see more hands. Okay, well, anybody think there are actually 14,000? 14,000. I don't see a single hand there. The actual answer is, ta-da, 140. And those are just the ones that we're aware of. So if you answered 140, congratulations, you got it right. Okay, so how do we manage social information around invisible disabilities? It's kind of interesting. There are a variety of terms that encompass our behaviors around this, and I'm just going to rattle off a couple of these for you. So passing is when a person with a significant hidden impairment seeks to appear to others as being non-disabled. A lot of people, I should add, walk around and they're not even aware that they are disabled. They think that they're stupid because they can't necessarily read, or they think that they may have problems because they can't remember things. And in fact, it could be a simple memory impairment. One thing I should like to say to you about this terminology is that learning disabilities only affect people of average to above average intelligence. Okay, so they are neurological in origin. They usually only affect a small part of your cognitive processing, and they are lifelong in nature. So those are some of the constructs around the definition of LDs. Second term is covering, efforts by people with a hidden disability to keep their impairment from dominating everyday interactions and defining that person. Sometimes you can go to work and you're going to have excellent, let's say, writing skills, and there's technology like word queue, speak queue, drag and dictate that can actually help you with writing. But what happens if your job description changes and they lay people off? So you may actually wind up being exposed. There tends to be a lot of shame that's attached to having a disability and trying to fit in and not fitting in as well. It took us a long time, and it continues to evolve, the emotional vocabulary that is attached to describing disabilities like this. They come with a completely, it's not the white cane, it's not the hearing aids, it's not the seeing eye dog that defines you. It's trying to convince people that you actually have some kind of a barrier that prevents you from functioning as equally as other people do in society, and then just not only disclosing it, but having people try to believe that. Oh yes, we're all disabled to some degree. Oh yes, I know all about, my favorite to this day is, oh yes, I know all about ADHD. My cousin has OCD, and which is obsessive compulsive disorder. Okay, go figure that one out. So disclosing a disability to a potential employer becomes a big deal. I have been in this field for a long time, and you have no idea how many times I've heard the phrase, well, if you, oh, why didn't you tell us before we hired you? I've also heard, well, the outcome might have been different had you told us during the interview stage. In other words, we wouldn't have hired you. It's really interesting just to hear the range of reactions that happen. Now, thankfully, with legislation like the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disability Act, the Ontario Human Rights Code, employment standards, it's making life a little bit easier for workers with disabilities. And on top of that, we're starting to see a seismic shift, if you will, or a sea change. Employers are actually reaching out to us and saying, hey, I've just recently hired somebody who's disclosed a disability. I want to support them, but I haven't the slightest idea how. Can you give us a hand? And so some of our services are shifting from watchdogging and advocacy to more of an education base, as well as an accommodations base, and making seizure plans and making learning plans to help people actually with their productivity in the workplace. So, and finally, teaching, which is kind of what I was alluding to earlier here, explaining to others the nature and the impact of one's hidden impairment. Okay, now, so here's something that you may not have known about. It is called, about 70% of all people with learning disabilities are affected by some form of auditory processing. It's probably the most common form of diagnosis. And so I've focused on dyslexia because that's the most frequently diagnosed learning disability. And a lot of it tends to center on sound blending and reading out the words and remembering the sounds that are associated with each letter and blending those letters as well as encoding that information and decoding too. So as an example for auditory processing, you may notice that some folks talk louder than necessary. Their reading progress stalls, or they may go through a stop-start process. They may use poor substitutions. Everybody's heard of Boschetti for spaghetti, and things like this. Disappointing performance in high-stakes tests, slow workers when writing tests or doing homework, struggling to remember a list or a sequence of words, in, into, at, to, over, above, under, through, with, without, for, of, down, beside, during. That's a prepositional list, and that was ingrained in grade 8. But those are also all connecting words, and people may have trouble identifying those. Sometimes they interpret words too literally, and they will often need words or sentences repeated to them as well. So I am just going to, I don't know if you've ever heard the McGurk effect, and I wanted to sort of actually, can you hang on just for a second? One thing I didn't get done, which I wanted to do, was the link for the McGurk effect. So I'm going to just retrieve this and I'll be right back. Okay. All right. Bear with me for a second here. Okay. All right. I'm sorry, I wanted to have the link here, and there we go. There we are. Okay, so this is going to be 1 minute. So just now, can you guys see this?
No.
You can't. Okay. Okay. I hope you can hear it.
Slide.
Now. All right.
We're not hearing anything.
Not doing anything?
We're not hearing any video, no.
Oh, you know. Okay, just a second here.
Or anything.
Can you hear that?
Very quiet.
Before I go any further, all right, so just before I go any further here, can you, all right, sorry about that. Is there, does any, I need to show you something. Oops, what's going on here? I need to operate. I have to go to video settings, I think, so that you'll be able to see the YouTube video. Is that correct?
Yes. If you want to share a video, do you want to share a video? Okay, then you need to make sure you click on those two check boxes on the share video screen. At the bottom of the share screen. Share sound and optimize for video.
Underneath the video.
Yeah. And then it's underneath the video.
Well, hold on, Michelle. Yeah, when you click on share screen and your screen, all your screens come up. There's two check boxes on that screen.
Okay.
Yeah, one's share video and the other one's optimize for video.
Optimize for video. Just bear with me. Sorry, folks.
That's all right. We'll edit this out.
So it's under stop video?
Well, you need, it's under share video, under share.
Like underneath the actual video, underneath the play, it's at the bottom on the left.
Yeah. When you go to share screen, Carter, if you click on share screen and you see all the screens that are available to share, on that screen are two tick boxes that you need to fill in.
Okay. Ah, there we go. Okay. Sorry. Now I got it. All right. Sorry, folks. All right. Here we go. So share screen. Okay, just bear with me one more time here. All right. YouTube. I got it.
We're seeing a blank screen right now.
You are. I'm pulling this. I'm just pulling it up. There we go. There we go. That's what I want. There we go. That's what I'm looking for. Okay, so I'm going to try and I'm going to resume the share. Why does this come up now? Sorry, postpone. All right. I'm going to do new share. And are we out? Can you guys see this now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So this lasts for a minute here. Hope you can hear it.
No, we're not hearing anything.
Ba ba.
Can you hear it?
Ba ba. Ba ba. Ba ba. Ba ba.
Can you see that?
I think we should explore.
Can you see that?
So fat.
Yes?
Yes, we did hear the ba ba bas.
No, but can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I'm just going to take it.
Ba ba.
Sorry. There we go. All right, one more time. Here we go.
Ba 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 ba.
Almost over.
Ba 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 ba.
Okay, did you see that? Did you guys all see that?
Yes, we did. I don't know exactly what I was seeing there, but it seems like that the person was pronouncing with slightly different consonants at the beginning of the A.
Exactly. And so this, oh, hold on, what's going on here? Now, I think I know what's going on. Hold on just a second. Yep, I know exactly what's going on. Okay, there we go. All right. So basically what was happening, that is called the McGurk effect. And I apologize for the technical trouble, folks. Thank you for your patience. There's a discrepancy between what we see sometimes and what we hear. That's a very complicated way of showing it to you. But sometimes when we look at the shape of people's mouths, it helps us understand what letters they're actually saying when they speak. People with auditory processing sounds will sometimes misinterpret what's being said to them. They will sometimes forget what is being said to them. They will sometimes, what is being said and what is being heard are two incongruent things. So the McGurk effect is meant to be a visual, it's meant to be a demonstration between what we see and what we hear and how those things are interpreted. Now, I don't know if you were seeing the video, it can also get very annoying over a period of time. So I tried to pick the shortest video, but the idea is that what they were doing in that video to demonstrate this incongruency was making a person sound B, but having V come out of their mouth, or having F come out of their mouth, fa, 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 and it was actually V. So it is meant to kind of give you an idea about how a person with auditory processing problems might actually process this information. And if I haven't said this before, please let me say it now. A learning disability, or a learning difference, as some people like to refer to it, is all about how you process information or how you don't process information. So that's something that I'd like to remind you of. Okay, so I'm going to just pull up my chart one more time, and bear with me. Open. Okay. All right. Okay. We're almost there. All right. There we go. I think I need a little, I think you guys should have a hat chat on how, okay, can you see the screen now?
Yes, we can.
You can?
Yes.
Okay. I don't see you I don't actually see you right now. So, all right, there we go. Maybe we can have a PowerPoint demonstration at some point. All right, not one of my greatest skills. Okay, so that is the McGurk effect. So it's a perceptual phenomenon that demonstrates an interaction between hearing and vision, In speech perception, the illusion occurs when the auditory component of one sound is paired with the visual component of another sound, leading to the perception of a third sound. Does that make sense? Okay. True or false? By the way, everybody can see the screen, right?
Yes, we can.
Yes, you can. Okay, because I'm not seeing you on my screen, so I just want to check in with you here. Okay, so true or false, there are upsides to dyslexia. Anybody have an answer for that?
I knew this lady who had dyslexia, and she was the most fabulous painter you could ever imagine.
Absolutely. And you know one of the reasons for that? A lot of people with dyslexia have auditory processing problems, so they compensate with visual skills. And some of the most amazingly talented people who are painters, interior decorators, architects, designers have had dyslexia. So it's partly because of the auditory processing piece that they compensate with the visual piece. And you would not be able to do that unless you had average to above average intelligence. Okay, so upside. Dyslexic learners are often more mature than their peers and possess a talent for seeing patterns and solving puzzles, more visual. Many dyslexic individuals are especially creative and display a particular enthusiasm for new ideas and concepts, brilliant conceptual thinkers. Many also have very high levels of comprehension when stories are read aloud or told to them. So in addition, they have however, they're usually unable to read at the same speed of their peers without explicit systemic instruction. Okay, so I'm going to keep going here. Now, that is kind of leads me into the next phase of this discussion here, which is about ADHD. And ADHD stands for, oh, we okay? Yep, okay. So ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. It's a complex brain disorder that impacts approximately 11% of children and about 5% of adults in the US. Those figures are very comparable to what we know about the population in Canada. ADHD is a developmental impairment of the brain's executive functions. People with ADHD have trouble with impulse control, focusing, and organization. Neuroscience, brain imaging, and clinical research tell us a few important things. And it tells us really about what ADHD is not, okay? It is not a behavior problem. It is not a mental illness. It is not a specific learning disability. It is, however, a developmental impairment of the brain's self-management system. It used to be said that people with learning disabilities paid attention to nothing, and that people with ADHD paid attention to everything. And that definition has gradually morphed into more focus on the executive functions, which we will be getting to in just a couple of minutes. So ADHD symptoms include things like inattention, lack of focus, poor time management, weak impulse control, exaggerated emotions, hyperfocus, which can actually be rather fascinating in its own, hyperactivity, and executive dysfunction. All right, I want to give you guys another skill testing question. How common is ADHD in school-age children? Is it 1 in 100? Is it 1 in 10, 5 in 100, 1 in 10,000, or 3 in 1,000? Are there any wild guesses out there?
1 in 10.
1 in 10. Okay, anybody else? You're gonna stop the share.
I agree with 1 in 10.
What? Yeah, 1 in 10. Okay, it's actually 5 in 100. So that's pretty significant. And a large number of Now, I'm not crazy about the way this is described, but a lot of children grow up, obviously, to be adults, but the symptoms will change over time. So the answer is, okay, just a second. There we go. The answer is 5 in 100. Okay, so there are generally, and this will vary sometimes depending on who you're talking to, but it's really about how this information is organized. There's generally 3 types of ADHD that are commonly accepted amongst doctors and people who work with these folks. So there is what a lot of folks tend to think of ADHD as being hyperactive and impulsive, and these folks, it's probably what we think of most when it comes to attention deficit. Little impulse control, always moving, squirming, talking at the most inappropriate times, interrupting people. They are impulsive, impatient, and hyperactive. There are, however, 2 other types of ADHD that we're going to touch on, and this is the exact opposite. So I tend to think of ADHD as moving along a kind of continuum or a spectrum, if you will. So you've got hyperactive on one end, and you have what we call inattentive on the other hand. And these folks have difficulty starting tasks, focusing, finishing tasks, just getting started. They lose track of their place when they're reading. They're very easily distracted. They forget things. They may come across as daydreamers or space cadets. They'll lose track of their homework, cell phones, their car keys. They'll get misplaced in conversations. They'll forget where they are. And actually, on a purely statistical level, more women are diagnosed with this type of ADHD than men are. This is a lot more visible because men tend to act out. Women tend to be better at covering things up. Now, there's a third type, which is combined. And these are folks that display a mixture of all the symptoms above. A physician will diagnose patients with a combined type of ADHD, and they will either meet the guidelines for inattentive or hyperactive or both, okay? And they must exhibit 6 to 9 symptoms identified for each subtype. I myself have been identified with combined subtype. And I just want to share a little anecdote with you about hyperfocus. So hyperfocus is when you are so focused on one subject or activity or a video game or something along those lines that there could be bombs happening, there could be a fire in the background, and you would never notice it, okay? And one day I had started a new job at an employment center, and this guy came in, and he was from China. He was an engineer, and he had the most fascinating resume. He had actually discovered a way of using corn husks as a form of energy. And so we sat down and I worked with him nonstop for about 2 hours on his resume. And I was so pleased with the results and the outcome. I thought, my boss is just going to be so proud of me, blah, blah, blah. And after the engineer left, my boss came up to me and said, well, fat lot of good you were. And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, well, didn't you notice? And I said, what? He said, the flood. And there were people literally running. It was a rainstorm outside, and it was a floor to ceiling window, and water was seeping in through the window frame, and people were running back and forth with mops and buckets, and I never noticed a thing. So that's one of the first instances in my life where I became aware of my own ADHD. So the causes of ADHD remain unclear. we think that genetics and heredity play a large part in determining who gets ADHD. In fact, a lot of parents discover that they have ADHD by taking their child's medication. And this, I've heard this more than once. Scientists are still investigating whether there's certain genes, however, especially ones linked to the neurotransmitter dopamine that play a defined role in developing ADHD. There's additional research that suggests that exposure to certain types of chemicals may increase a child's risk of having ADHD. But I think it's also important to point out what ADHD is not. It is not caused by bad parenting. It is not caused by too much sugar. It's not caused by too much video games. Like learning disabilities, ADHD is a brain-based biological disorder. Okay, so there have been brain imaging and studies and other research that show that there are actual physiological differences in the brains of kids living with ADHD versus the brains of so-called normal people. I also want to point out that ADHD, we'll come to that in a second, actually. I want to first ask another question. True or false? ADHD is a relatively new disorder. Is that true or is that false? Let's see a hands up. Hands. Raise, use the hands up feature, please. Okay. Okay. The answer is false. ADHD was actually first described by a Scottish doctor as early as 1798. That's almost as I am old. It wasn't the formal diagnosis for ADHD was actually first suggested in the 1980s, but the behaviors associated with ADHD were just first described a long, long time ago. So, I work primarily with adults, not with children. And so I'm a little bit more familiar with that population. And so the statistic of 4% of the population in North America is generally what is thought to be the population that exists with ADHD. They figure, however, that this number is underreported, as up to 85% of all kids with ADHD are at risk for having the disorder as adults, and only 10% of adults with ADHD receive treatment. So because this is an invisible disability, a lot of people go through life without ever being diagnosed. Another thing that happens is that people may, in fact, be diagnosed with dyslexia and have some kind of a comorbid ADHD that is often missed during the diagnosis. Or, likewise, they may be diagnosed with ADHD, but the learning disability may be missed as well. And it's the norm, not the exception, that most people living with ADHD have some kind of coexisting condition that goes along with them, which also happen to be often invisible disabilities. So, when we're talking about untreated ADHD in adults, there can be many, many different types of negative impacts, and this includes work, relationships. Sometimes relationships end on a dime. People impulsively quit their jobs or get fired. There are increased incidents of mental health and distress, and symptoms and behaviors can include things like trouble managing time, I'm always late, impatience, disorganization, forgetfulness, mood swings can all cause problems for the individual living with it. So it gets a little bit tougher managing some of these things. Now, I just wanted to spend a minute or two talking about executive functions here. And so these are what I'll call a skill set, okay, that reside in the frontal lobe of the brain. And executive functions are so named because they were deemed necessary for individuals to be successful in the workplace. So a way of being able to just define some of these components are cognitive and mental abilities that help people engage in goal-directed action. They direct actions, they control behavior, and they motivate us to achieve our goals and prepare for future events. So people living with executive dysfunction disorder struggle to organize and regulate their behaviors in ways that'll help them accomplish long-term goals. So the definition of ADHD has actually morphed to include a lot more focus on the executive functions, which are self-regulating behaviors. Okay, so we all have problems and strengths with executive dysfunction, with executive functions that can affect work, learning, relationships. But for people with ADHD, those struggles can become something entirely different and something entirely chronic. Okay, so there's yep.
There is a black box at the bottom of the screen and it cuts out the last row or two. Can you get rid of that?
I'm not quite sure how to do this, but what I can do is I can send Richard the PowerPoint, if that helps.
Well, Carter, it's probably just a pop-up at the bottom of your screen. If there's anything popped up at the bottom of your screen, close it or move it, because it is blocking your presentation.
It is. Okay, let me just stop the share here. Okay, and then I'm going to do a share screen again, and hopefully that box will disappear. I'm not seeing that on my screen. So just give me a second here. Let's try this again. And share. Is that black box still there?
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Oh, I'm sorry. I don't know how to get rid of it.
And there's two others now that are appearing
Oh,
at the
wait a
top
minute.
part of the
Wait a
screen.
minute. Wait a
Yeah,
minute.
that's it. Move that.
Okay. Is that
Keep moving. Nope, just keep moving that
How
or
about this?
moving it away from your share.
Yeah. How about this? Does that help?
No, now it's blocking your titles.
So you can read us the titles.
I'll read you guys the titles. How about that? Okay. Okay. So actually, I want to go back up. Just give me a second here. Okay. So there are 7 different types of executive function behaviors. And again, I just want to point out this is a definition. It is not the definition. So these it's really just a matter of how this information is organized. So in this particular model, there are 7 different types of behaviors that are associated with executive functions. There's self-awareness, which is the ability to command self-directed attention. There's self-restraint, also known as inhibition. What we call non-verbal working memory and verbal working memory. So working memory is a form of short-term memory that allows us to hold information in our brains long enough to be able to complete a task usually. Although there are other definitions attached to that as well. Emotional management, so using words and images along with self-awareness to alter how you feel about things. Self-motivation, which is controls things like activation, being able to motivate yourself to do things when there are no outside consequences, and planning and problem solving. So finding new approaches and solutions. All right. What functions do executive functions allow people to do? One example is the following: analyzing a task, being able to address the task and planning how to do that, organizing the steps needed to carry out that task, developing timelines for completing the task, adjusting or shifting the steps if necessary to complete the task, and completing the task in a timely way. If a person with ADHD is working on something and trying to engage in some kind of problem solving, and let's say Michelle comes along and says, hey, I got to talk to you for a couple of minutes. It might be like a little bomb going off in my head. I turn to her, talk to her about whatever needs to be talked about. I go back to my task and it's gone. And it may take a long time for me to get back on track because that distraction has completely taken me away. This isn't going to apply for everybody, but it's meant to illustrate, again, that ADHD is an umbrella condition that affects different people in different ways. So when a person has weak executive functions in certain areas, they may have trouble analyzing, planning, organizing, scheduling, or completing tasks. People with executive dysfunction disorder, by the way, this can also stand on its own, or it can exist in conjunction with ADHD, lack the ability to handle frustration, starting and finishing tasks, recall, following multi-step directions, staying on track, self-monitoring, and balancing tasks like academic demands. Remediating the area of the deficit reduces academic or work difficulties. So the word comorbidities is something you're going to hear about in the future, all right? And a comorbidity is a condition or a disorder, often invisible, by the way, that exists side by side with the ADHD, with the learning disability, with epilepsy, that we may not necessarily recognize. And I just wanted to give you, and again, as I mentioned earlier, it's the norm, actually, not the exception, that these conditions exist alongside the ADHD. So for example, learning disabilities are the most commonly diagnosed disorder that coexists with ADHD. It exists in about 75 to 80% of the cases. A couple of definitions for you. So dyslexia is often associated with reading, but the definition of that has become expanded in recent years. Dyscalculia, which is something else that I live with, is the numerical version of dyslexia, and people with living with this condition have problems processing numbers. They can very often process them, but the processing speed is often severely compromised. Dyspraxia has to do with motor coordination. Dysgraphia has to do with handwriting. And there's another one that I like called dysnomia, which is word recall. There are conduct disorders or behavioral problems often associated with ADHD. And these include things like oppositional defiance disorder or conduct disorder. And antisocial personality disorder. These are relatively new issues that have been identified by the American Psychological Association. And without intervention, a child may move from ODD to CD to ASPD as they age. Although these conditions are more in common with males. Males have a tendency to act out a little bit more. It's critical to get help early on, and treatment is best undertaken by a team of providers. A large number of people living with ADHD also have anxiety. And this is very, very common. People living with epilepsy as well. It's about 30%. Once an individual takes stimulant medication and gains focus and control, the anxiety can wane. There are medications that can actually trigger anxiety as well. When we're talking about depression, this is also a very high level sorry, my phone's going off, a little distracting. So depression is very common in people with epilepsy. It's actually the most commonly diagnosed comorbidity. And it's present in about 25% of all people living with ADHD as well. So if the person responds well to ADHD medication, performance improves and the depression disappears, not always entirely, but it does subside somewhat. However, sometimes a person has a primary depression as well, and that may require its own treatment. All right. Dysthymia is low-level depression. It's basically what we refer to as the blues. So it's less severe than depression, but it actually does last longer. Lifelong low mood. There are many terms for this, but a common clinical observation is that people who have ADHD struggle with low mood and emotional dysregulation. Bipolar, this is a really interesting statistic for me. Up to 1 in 13 people living with attention deficit disorder have comorbid bipolar disorder. And last but not least, substance abuse goes hand in hand very commonly with ADHD as well. Okay, so in terms of living with these conditions, we talk about disclosure, and I just want to be I just want to say a few words about this, because this is probably in terms of employment the #1 issue that people are dealing with. How do I disclose? To whom? When do I disclose? What do I say? How much do I share? How much do I not share? And this becomes a very, very individual decision for a lot of people. Right now, I'm dealing with somebody who has actually disclosed their epilepsy, but they're also living with a mental health condition, and they have chosen, they are adamant about it in terms of not disclosing because they're afraid of the stigma that's attached to it. This is obviously a human rights issue, and disclosing a disability is the route to workplace accommodation, yet disclosing can be highly risky with many possible disadvantages. A lot of people have not been hired, or they've found their way to being laid off after disclosure. Sometimes what happens is that somebody may be very well accommodated on the job, and their supervisor is incredibly supportive, but they have careers as well, and they move on. I find in, our world that when a new supervisor comes along and replaces the old one, they're often not informed about the person living with a learning disability or ADHD or epilepsy. And they wound up having, all of a sudden, their work performance starts getting criticized, and incident reports occur, and that person's job increasingly becomes threatened. So in light of that, invisible disabilities tend to be a little bit less trusted, if you will, than other types. In fact, back in 2011, there was a provincial survey that was done in British Columbia, and 88% of all people living with invisible conditions had a negative view about disclosure. They have done similar studies in Ontario, and they found in that particular study that disclosure actually varied by the impairments. So people who were living with different levels of blindness actually were most likely to disclose, whereas people living with learning disabilities and mental health were at the bottom of the list in terms of wanting to share information. Okay. However, you cannot really get an accommodation without disclosure. So disclosure should really be approached, accommodations should really be approached as a partnership between the employer, the person living with the disability, the immediate supervisor, and possibly a union or a professional body. They say to give as much information as possible in advance in accessible formats, and post workplace policies on accommodation, diversity, equity on the web. And that's for people, they want to try and encourage a disclosure positive environment in the workplace. And there's been a massive sea change in that direction, forming employee groups around it, having job fairs and information fairs related to the disability. A lot more education and sharing of information is starting to make itself present in the workplace, and that's a good thing. Employers can also, during the recruitment phase, provide space and time for the individual to talk and possibly disclose about their disability, and have a plan and procedures in place when the person actually does disclose. Okay, and some of you may have heard these studies before, but it may bear repeating. There is a myth out there in terms of from employers who have always thought that accommodations are actually going to be seriously expensive. They think of installing ramps that costs thousands of dollars or possibly technology, but they have found that actually most accommodations are $500 or less. So these employment studies emphasize the benefits of employee dependability and loyalty. And in fact, very often workers with disability are far more loyal to the company than their able-bodied counterparts. There's a thing right now that's happening, a phenomenon in North America, some of you may have heard of, called the Great Resignation or the Big Quit. And people have found that they really, really like working from home, being with their children and their families. And right now, there's about 50% of all employers who are struggling to retain employees, struggling to try and hire them. And a lot of people are simply not wanting to go back to their old jobs where they were struggling to survive, where they weren't receiving benefits, where the environment was somewhat toxic. And interestingly enough, 36% of all these people who are quitting don't have a job to go to. So, and this is somewhat unprecedented. So this is a really, really good time for people with disabilities to actually be hired and to be able to step up to the plate and make themselves available and hopefully be considered for future positions. Okay. We're talking about making accommodations and managing these things on a more effective level for staff and for recruiters. And so here's a couple of tips. Many workplace accommodations for people with visible or invisible disabilities simply is about managing the situation effectively rather than making exceptions. Accommodations are designed to increase productivity, and they're not designed to create favoritism in any stretch. So it's about having clear expectations and defining what the outcomes are supposed to be about. It's based on mutual trust, which fosters open dialogue and regular communications. It's about bringing in human resource managers or disability managers as needed to be part of the team to help that person be able to function in the workplace as much as possible. In some cases, not everybody, the 9-to-5 world, the 9-to-5 model of work does not fit everybody. You can do a whole workshop just on this, but sometimes being allowed to work flexible hours, working from home or telecommuting is one of the best things that can be offered to somebody with this kind of a disability. Assist them returning to work after an absence due to a disability, and evaluate accommodations as their effectiveness in the workplace. Okay, so can I get a volunteer? Anybody?
Sure, Carter, I'll step in.
Okay, thanks. So I'd like to conclude with something called the Stroop effect, which you may or you may not be familiar with. So in psychology, the Stroop effect is the delay in reaction time between congruent and incongruent stimuli, okay? The effect has been used to create a psychological test that is widely used in clinical practice and investigation. So again, I'm going back, it's a cognitive exercise that really kind of focuses on your reaction time. So Richard, you're going to volunteer, right?
Yes.
Okay, so what I'd like you to do is I would like you to read the color left to right, not the word. Okay, I'd like you to read the color, not the word. Go.
Green, yellow, white, pink, orange, blue, red, yellow, green, blue, red, blue, green, red, pink, blue, big block in the middle of my screen. Yeah,
What?
Yellow, No, okay. Okay, green. Whatever that color is, orange maybe,
Yes.
red, blue, orange, red, green. Done.
Okay,
It was
bravo.
it was very difficult, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. That brings us to the end of the presentation. You lucky people. So I'm stopping the share. No more black boxes. Thanks you very much for the presentation. I hope everybody's okay. I'm just wondering if there are any questions or comments.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll open up the floor now to questions. So if you have a question, either raise your actual hand. I would prefer to see a virtual hand. It's easier for me to detect. But I'm certainly in the room here. Anybody that has a question, I can relay it to Carter to make sure he gets it. But the one question I might have is, I see that there, on the one side, as you've identified, there's like 140 different conditions that make up kind of this umbrella of conditions. And then there's very many shadings within that of
Yes.
the degrees of which, the severity to which someone will experience those conditions. And so on the one side, I can very much see the comment that was made earlier to say everybody has a disability. But on the other side, I can see that there's a lot of sensitivity from the community of people that have serious, lifelong, debilitating conditions, that they would not want that kind of language to be spoken because it may sort of denigrate that. So, as I said, I can see both things being true. And how do we resolve that sort of conflict in the best possible way to not to disadvantage people that have actual conditions that need to be accommodated?
I think more than anything, you have to normalize the situation, and we talk a lot about diversity today, and we tend to think of diversity as applying to particular groups of people, but we have to recognize that within those groups, and it tends to apply to women, people of color, First Nations people, and people with disabilities. But within those communities, there are all kinds of different subtypes as well. You may have heard of a term called neurodiversity, and that's the recognition that there are now. Usually, not always, but often, that particular term is used in application to people living with various types of autism. And really, we need to start expanding our thinking about neurodiversity, because as we've seen today, people living with epilepsy, attention deficit, learning disabilities, these are all brain-based conditions. There are other brain-based conditions out there as well that comprise and expand upon our current knowledge of neurodiversity. And I think once we start normalizing that, we're going to have a greater acceptance and understanding of and incorporation of that into everyday life. I hope that answers your question.
It was adjacent to it, certainly. If there's no further questions at the moment, I would just go back to that and just to say that, Catherine's got a question for you. I'll get to in just 1 second. But the question, I guess, is that I can see, as I said, that almost everybody needs some sort of degree of accommodation, that I can see myself on the list of many conditions that are there. I can see that I have some tendencies towards those things, and those things could increase with my age, going through my life as I become older. And certainly people with sort of geriatric versions of those conditions may be exacerbated, or just an acute situation where there's a particular stress going on in your life that kind of brings out some of these tendencies that need to be accommodated. Mm-hmm. And so on the one side, you've got a lot of people experiencing these conditions. On the other side, you've got people who have them as a stable and lifelong challenge to themselves. So how do we kind of, where do we draw the line, I guess, between those two sort of groups, which seem to encompass a lot of the population, and without, as I said, disadvantaging those people that have these stable challenges for their whole lives?
Yeah, it's an interesting dilemma. One thing I definitely want to say is that accommodating people with disabilities is actually very, very minor if you look at it in terms of pure statistics. When you think that people are being accommodated for religious reasons, That happens. That's normalized. That happens almost on a daily basis. When we're thinking about, and I'm seeing, again, I'm seeing the word in the chat box from a couple of people saying routine would be better than normal. I mean normalizing in terms of accepting it as a given, that people need to accept it as a routine. So whatever term you want to apply to it is absolutely yes. And language, just like our knowledge of disabilities, continues to evolve. But in terms of religious reasons, sickness, children, the changing nature of families, we are accommodating people all the time. And now, especially after COVID, people are now working from home, which is now another form of accommodation because people want to spend more time with their families. People are, can work a little bit more flexible hours, which is another form of accommodation as well. So I think the model of work is actually changing, and the culture of work that's attached to that is also changing. And people are realizing that people with differences can actually be more productive at home sometimes than, and I also think that becomes more of an equalizing factor as well. So accommodation should be about productivity. It should not be about favoritism. It should not be perceived that way at all. It's not exactly what I want to say, but I think you.
Well, thank you, Carter.
Okay.
I think that gets to the heart of the matter. Thank you very much.
I hope so.
I've got Catherine Francis here who wants to ask you a question or a comment. Just a moment.
Hi, Catherine.
Actually, I have quite a few, but I'll just try to be quick.
I'll do my best.
Okay, so the first one is, when you said the true or false about dyslexia, about it being benefits, it wasn't clear to me that those are actually benefits of dyslexia, as opposed to some people with dyslexia also have remarkable abilities in something else. So can we really say that the dyslexia is a good thing because there are benefits? That's my first comment.
So there's an upside. Yep.
Yeah, well, or is it just that people with dyslexia happen to have other very positive attributes that come out? Anyway, the second one is just a little comment. I was sure one of your slides said 10% of children had ADHD, and then the next slide you tested us and it said 5 out of 20, and I found a disconnect between those two. My third one, and this is kind of an interesting observation, when you did that thing with the lips and the sound, I have noticed a lot of times when I'm on Zoom and people show videos that they're out of sync. And maybe it's just, with me, but other people haven't noticed them out of sync. And I just kind of wondered whether your test was also out of sync because of Zoom, like it was screwing brains up. Because I felt that they didn't match at all. Not just the sounds, but they didn't match at all. So
that was the point. That was the point of the demonstration, was that they didn't match at all.
But I find that happens a lot when I'm on Zoom, when people are showing videos like that. There's and maybe because I'm partly deaf, I help to read lips and it tries, which is why I cannot watch movies that are dubbed. Like
I know, yeah, I hear you on that one for sure.
And my last one, and I'm sorry, I know I'm hogging, but there weren't a ton.
Not at all. It's fine.
So my last one was my son was diagnosed as very severely ADHD, but then when we also went through the school, they also said he had a learning disability, and I realized we went through his whole school system without me actually knowing what is the learning disability. I'm thinking, okay, he was diagnosed gifted LD, and he had the education plans all throughout. I don't know what the learning disability is. Were they just calling it a learning disability because he had ADHD?
No, not necessarily, because it's the actual terminology that they usually apply to this. And again, I'm not, like, school age children is not necessarily my area of expertise, but the preferred term these days tends to be a specific learning disability, so that they're going to try and identify something in terms of language processing or auditory memory or something along these lines. So usually, a good assessment is going to identify what the specific learning disability, which one of the 140 it is, versus as well as the accommodation, and that should be included in the IEP that your son probably received or should have received.
Maybe I should go back and look and see. Maybe they actually told us one, but I don't remember them telling us what it was. I mean, his accommodations, he got to write tests in separate rooms or take longer and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, all right, sorry.
No, thank you very much. And I also want to point out, apropos of what you were saying regarding the so-called upside of learning disabilities, is that people often with any kind of disability have enormous problem-solving skills. They develop incredible resilience as a result of their disability. They have a different way of seeing the world that most of their able-bodied counterparts don't see. And the other part of that is that because, and again, this is just dyslexia at this point, their auditory skills may be somewhat compromised. They're going to develop tremendous visual processing, visual memory, visual spatial, visual motor skills that will actually be enhanced as a result of this. And so that's going to be an incredibly valuable asset when it comes to the workplace, because you're going to be contributing to all kinds of different workplace processes and having different outcomes than you otherwise would have without that contribution to be able to be made. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say about that in terms of the so-called upside. It still remains, I'm not trying to put it down as not being a serious issue. It absolutely is. And in fact, they say that 10% of the population does have some form of learning disability. That's pretty significant. And we still have a lot of work to do in that area. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Carter. We'll go to Nash now. Nash at work. You've got
Nash.
a question or a comment.
Good morning, Carter. Amazing lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm going to say an observation from my point of view, working in the medical field, and please comment on what I see. I have a feeling that there is, first of all, lack of understanding of ADHD and learning disabilities among a lot of the medical practitioners. That is leading to lack of diagnosis, lack of treatment, and possible, and this is a point where I feel like kind of frustration, is that people are not living, at best people are not living to their potential, and in many cases things are spiraling to the point of as far as criminality, and I've seen that. If you can comment, it would be great.
Yeah, so it's amazing that, well, first of all, thank you for your comments. I think that's really, really insightful, and I appreciate hearing that. So that's number one. Number two, there are a disproportionate number of people in the prison system that are represented with undiagnosed ADHD. And they tend to have a greater level of head injury and brain injury as resulting from fights. They tend to be more, there tends to be a higher representation of drug use as a result, and alcoholism. And again, people are drinking to kind of cope their minds. They're drinking and taking drugs to just because their self-esteem has just been so battered. They're acting out impulsively. And there's a high level of illiteracy as well in the prison system too. So yes, there are tremendous social consequences. Historically, men are the gender that tends to act out the most. And a lot of these folks have never been diagnosed with attention deficit. Okay, we have to recognize that the actual definition of ADHD wasn't really incorporated until the 1980s, and it wasn't taken as seriously either. So yes, I think the other thing I think that's really important to recognize, not sure where oh, there he is. Okay, you jumped around on my screen here. The other thing to recognize is that there is no agreed upon definition, and as such, the medical framework is probably going to be a little bit different from the educational framework, which will be different from other frameworks as well. And on top of that, there are different attitudes and definitions in the North American social structure for working with ADHD than there is in Europe. It's a completely different model it's more of a biosocial model that they have over there. So, so yes, I agree with you, and I hope that answers your question to some degree.
Yeah, quite a bit. I just have an extra point that
Sure.
I noticed that, knowing that stimulants is a big part of this treatment of many conditions of ADHD, I notice reluctance, and sometimes people who are on such medications are stigmatized in a way in the eyes of their even medical professionals, which I think is unfortunate.
I agree with that. As a social worker, I can't really comment on the use of medications because I'm not a doctor. But look at it this way. If you're going to be taking medication for a cold, if you're going to be taking medication to manage your seizures, if you're going to be taking medication to manage other conditions, why should that be any more why should the stigma be higher for ADHD than it would be for other conditions, right? So that's kind of my take on it, but yeah, I agree. The other thing though too is that I think medication by itself is most likely incomplete. I think with ADHD, there is the holy triumvirate of behavioral therapy and things like cognitive behavioral therapy and job coaching and things like this that can also contribute to the betterment of people's performance. And one thing I wanted to say in relation to your previous comment was about one of the big I'm not sure what one of the big limitations, I suppose, for want of a better word, is people's underperformance when they're living with ADHD. And that's a really, really sad comment because they're not living up to their own potential. And the impact on self-esteem, the impact on agency is also something that really needs to be addressed as well. So.
Wow, thank you very much, Carter. That was a fantastic presentation. Really enjoyed that, and the good questions after as well. And maybe just a last comment to wrap it up, just to say that the project of humanism is really about individuals being unshackled from kind of societal norms. This is sort of cultural things that aren't affecting us, and enabled by a society that understands them and accepts them and supports them, so that everyone can achieve and contribute in their own way. And so I think that any thoughts about people with invisible disabilities and thinking about those things in terms of who we work with, who our friends are, who we interact on an everyday basis is a very important way to look at this, so that we are making sure that they're able to contribute and to be part of the society instead of being pushed into a place where they need to be, that they're not contributing because we are not allowing them to. So this is a very humanistic topic, and I'm glad that you were here to present it today. So thank you very much to Carter.
Thank you.